My name is Janice Hamilton, and I've just recently finished writing a book called Reinventing Themselves, A History of the Hamilton and Forrester Families. Those were my father's parents. I think that a lot of people just want to know who they are and how they got here. And I'm the product of my parents and my grandparents, and I was curious about who these people were, and I just wanted to learn more. And fortunately, I found a lot of the information. It's there if you dig for it. I think that my family are interesting because they were, in a sense, typical of a lot of immigrant families. They came to Canada from Scotland in the 1830s. They became farmers here. 50 years later, when the Western Canada, the prairies were opening up to settlement, they went west and they became farmers out west. Eventually, Hamiltons and Forresters ended up settling near Winnipeg. And then as the generations progressed, they basically, most of them left farming, some of them left Western Canada, some of them moved further west, some of them moved to California. They spread out. And I think, in a sense, that's sort of the history of North America. For both of those families, when they were in Scotland, they were basically tradespeople. You know, there was a wheelwright, which is a fancy word for carpenter, basically. One of them was a weaver. His father had been a tailor. There was a stonemason also. And so when they came here, they had to not only adjust to a new climate, and they had to build their own houses, and they had to totally change their lives. And they had to learn how to farm here because it wasn't the same as it was in Scotland. So they reinvented themselves the first time. And then the next generation, when they went west, it was a different kind of climate, a different type of soil, and they had to learn how to farm in another fashion. And then the next generation basically ended up, some of them left the land and went to the city and got university degrees and became doctors and lawyers and whatever. And the beginnings of the family were formed when they came over and they made this big change. They took a risk. And I admire the fact that they had to take that risk and that they did it. I don't know that I would have had that courage. I'm particularly interested in the women's stories because the women, they're not well documented, and you really have to dig for their stories because they're just, the wives of so-and-so. With the men, you would find the land records and the wills or the, voting records or whatever, and the women, you'll find them in the census. And that's, and also I found a lot of death records, which was interesting because that shows the cause of death. And I was interested to find that there weren't as many deaths in childbirth as one might have expected, but that was encouraging. There was one death of a woman that I found really sad, and that was the Hamiltons. There were the family that went to Saskatoon and later moved to Winnipeg. They had a 23-year-old daughter, and she died of, I think it was typhoid. And she was only 23, but she'd written these 2 letters back home to her relatives in Scarborough, Ontario. And she described seeing the Hudson's Bay, the caravans carrying all the buffalo hides en route to Prince Albert or wherever they were going. And she described they were there during the 1885 Louis Riel Rebellion, the Northwest Rebellion. And after the battle at Batoche, the soldiers came to Saskatoon, where my family was living, and they sort of used it as a field hospital. So the Hamilton family were there, helping the soldiers recover, and she described making all these, the bread to feed the soldiers, and then they had a big party before the soldiers came back to Eastern Canada. And she just sounded like such a nice, smart, observant, compassionate person. And that just made me sad that she died so young. But that happened a lot. So there were a lot of ghosts in the Hamilton closet. My father had a twin. My father was born in 1915, and the pandemic came along. We're all familiar with the pandemic now. And his twin brother at age 3 died of the flu. His father was a doctor, and his mother had trained as a nurse, and they were devastated. I mean, everybody in the house got the flu, and my father lost his eardrum. Anyway, so this little boy died, and after that, the parents started to get interested in psychic phenomena, because the whole question, and it wasn't just them, it was something that happened in society as a whole. People had either lost loved ones during World War I, or they had lost people during the influenza pandemic. So there was just a lot of death, and a lot of people were traumatized, and a lot of people were trying to contact their loved ones. And so a lot of people held seances, and they met with mediums, and it was a very, very common thing. Only my family did it in a big way. They had seances at their house, like for 10 years. There was a core group of people that met every week, and they would contact with a control, like a person who had died and was on the other side, so to speak, and would tell them, and they would set up, they had a whole bank of cameras all set up to record, and they had ectoplasm would appear sometimes, like this sort of looks like cotton wool stuff would appear. It was very bizarre. So I have no idea what was going on. Those photographs that they took, like the hundreds of glass negatives, are at the University of Manitoba. It was my aunt who gave the collection to the university. They have inspired art forms and plays, and apparently it is the most consulted collection in, in the University of Manitoba archives. Anyway, that's just a crazy aspect that as a descendant, it's kind of hard to deal with. But, what can you do? You can't change who your ancestors were or what they did. I know one of the reasons why I wrote this book is because someday when I'm gone and the stories about my life have disappeared because nobody asked me. Actually, I have written about something about my life, so that the day that I die and they say, well, why did Mom do such and such? And oh, yes, it's in the book she wrote. But I had to dig for it in terms of finding out where my ancestors had come from. And it's been a great pleasure to dig for it. But now that I've learned it myself, I can't just keep it to myself. I have to write it down for future generations so that my grandchildren will know that their Scottish ancestors came from ordinary roots, and they were like many other Canadians and came and farmed and owned their land because that was one of the things they wanted to do. They needed to own their own land. They couldn't do that in Scotland. They were smart and they were hardworking, but they just couldn't get ahead. And here there was opportunity to get ahead. So they took a risk and they came here, and someday my grandchildren will read the book. I hope that they'll admire their ancestors for having taken those risks.